The Royal Guard's Journey. Begins Captain Marcus Wellington had served the Royal Guard with unwavering dedication for 15 years. His chest bore the weight of numerous medals, each telling a story of courage, sacrifice, and honor. Today, however, he wasn't wearing his ceremonial uniform or standing at attention beside the palace gates. Instead, he sat quietly in the departure lounge of Heathrow Airport, dressed in simple civilian clothes, waiting for his flight to New York. Marcus had been granted a rare 2-week leave to attend his daughter's graduation from Columbia University. Sarah was graduating with honors in international law, and nothing in the world could have kept him from being there. She was his pride and joy, the one bright light that had guided him through the darkest moments of his military career. The announcement came over the intercom. Flight BA 175 to New York JFK is now ready for boarding. We will begin with our first-class passengers. Marcus looked down at his boarding pass. Seat 2A, first class. It had taken him months to save up for this ticket, but Sarah's graduation was worth every penny. He wanted to arrive fresh and rested, ready to celebrate this milestone with his daughter. As he approached the gate, Marcus felt a familiar sense of pride. Even in civilian clothes, he carried himself with the distinctive posture that years of military training had instilled in him. His back was straight, his steps measured, and his eyes alert. Other passengers seemed to sense something different about him, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. The flight attendant, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and an overly bright smile, barely glanced at his boarding pass before waving him toward the aircraft. Marcus made his way down the jet bridge, his small carry-on bag slung over his shoulder. Inside that bag were gifts for Sarah, a watch that had belonged to his father, also a military man, and a photo album chronicling her childhood that he had carefully assembled over the years. Upon entering the aircraft, Marcus was struck by the luxury of the first-class cabin. He had never flown first class before, always choosing economy to save money. The seats were spacious, covered in soft leather, and each had its own entertainment system. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the cabin, offering champagne and warm towels to the boarding passengers. Marcus found his seat and settled in, placing his bag in the overhead compartment with care. He had arrived early, hoping to get comfortable and perhaps catch up on some reading during the 8-hour flight. The book in his jacket pocket was a biography of Winston Churchill, a man he greatly admired for his leadership during Britain's darkest hour. As more passengers boarded, Marcus observed them with the trained eye of someone accustomed to assessing situations and people. There were business executives in expensive suits talking loudly on their phones about deals and mergers. A famous actress whose face he recognized from billboards sat across the aisle, her assistant fussing over her comfort. Near the front, an elderly gentleman with a walking stick was helped to his seat by a flight attendant. Everything seemed normal until Marcus noticed the flight attendant who had checked his boarding pass earlier, whispering urgently to her colleague near the galley. Both women kept glancing in his direction, their expressions troubled. Marcus couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language suggested they were discussing him. The senior flight attendant, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and a more authoritative presence, approached his seat with a forced smile. "Excuse me, sir," she said in a voice that carried barely concealed suspicion. "Could I see your boarding pass and identification again, please?" Marcus complied without question, reaching into his jacket pocket to retrieve his passport and boarding pass. His movements were calm and measured, though internally he wondered what could possibly be wrong. His documents were in perfect order, and he had gone through security without any issues. The flight attendant examined his documents with unusual scrutiny, comparing the photo in his passport to his face multiple times. She then walked away, taking his boarding pass with her, leaving Marcus sitting there with growing confusion. Other first-class passengers had begun to notice the commotion, some craning their necks to see what was happening. Minutes passed, and Marcus remained patient, drawing on the discipline that had served him well throughout his military career. He had learned long ago that losing one's temper rarely solved problems and often made them worse. However, as the delay continued, he began to feel the first stirrings of concern. The flight was scheduled to depart soon, and he couldn't afford to miss it. Sarah's graduation ceremony was in 2 days, and there were no other flights that would get him there in time. The senior flight attendant returned, this time accompanied by a man in a captain's uniform. The pilot looked uncomfortable, as if he had been dragged into a situation he would rather avoid. "Sir," the flight attendant said, her tone now openly hostile, "we're going to need you to gather your belongings and come with us." "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite his growing alarm. "My documents are in order and I've done nothing wrong." "That may be," the captain interjected, clearly trying to diffuse the tension, "but we've received some concerns about your presence in first class. We just need to sort this out quickly so we can depart on time." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He had faced enemy fire, survived dangerous missions, and stood guard in some of the world's most volatile locations. But this situation left him feeling vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The other passengers were now openly staring, some with curiosity, others with obvious discomfort. "What kind of concerns?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. His skin color, his quiet demeanor, his unwillingness to engage in the loud, ostentatious behavior that seemed to characterize some of the other first-class passengers, it all added up to a picture that apparently didn't fit someone's idea of who belonged in first class. The flight attendant's response confirmed his suspicions. "Sir, we just don't think you're comfortable in this cabin. Perhaps you'd be happier in economy where you might feel more at home." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. After 15 years of serving his country, of putting his life on the line to protect the very freedoms and values that made Britain great, he was being told he didn't belong in first class because of how he looked. The irony was not lost on him that he, who had sworn an oath to protect the crown and all its subjects, was now being treated as if he were the threat. Marcus stood slowly, his military training keeping his emotions in check even as his mind raced with anger and disappointment. He looked around the cabin at the faces staring back at him, some sympathetic, others indifferent, a few openly hostile. In that moment, he made a decision that would change not only his life, but also the lives of everyone on that aircraft. The humiliation unfolds. Marcus remained standing beside his seat, his mind processing the surreal situation unfolding around him. The captain shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, clearly aware that something was terribly wrong but seemingly unwilling to challenge his crew's judgment. The senior flight attendant stood with her arms crossed, her expression suggesting she was dealing with a troublesome passenger rather than a decorated military veteran. "Sir, we really need you to move along," she said, her voice growing sharper. "We have a schedule to maintain and other passengers are waiting." Marcus glanced around the cabin once more. The businessman in the seat behind him was recording the entire incident on his phone, no doubt planning to share it on social media later. The actress across the aisle had put on oversized sunglasses, as if to distance herself from the unpleasant scene. The elderly gentleman near the front was shaking his head in apparent disgust, though whether at the situation or at Marcus himself was unclear. "I paid for this seat," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of command. "My ticket is valid, my documents are in order, and I have done nothing to warrant this treatment." The flight attendant's colleague, the young blonde who had initially checked his boarding pass, whispered something in her ear. Marcus caught fragments of their conversation, words like suspicious and doesn't belong that confirmed his worst fears about what was happening. "Look," the captain said, attempting to mediate, "perhaps we can find you a nice seat in business class. Same meal service, almost as comfortable. What do you say?" Marcus felt his jaw tighten. The offer of business class wasn't about comfort or customer service. It was about moving him away from the predominantly white, wealthy passengers in first class. It was about making him less visible, less threatening to their sense of who belonged in premium seating. "Captain," Marcus said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that made several passengers look up sharply. "I served in Her Majesty's Royal Guard for 15 years. I have protected members of the royal family, defended this nation's interests in hostile territories, and sworn an oath to uphold the values that supposedly make Britain great. Are you really going to stand there and tell me that I don't belong in a seat I paid for with my own money?" The captain's face flushed red. For a moment, Marcus thought he might have gotten through to him, that the man's sense of fairness might override his crew's prejudices. But then the captain's expression hardened and Marcus realized that his revelation had actually made things worse. "Are you threatening us, sir?" the senior flight attendant interjected, her voice rising loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "Because that's what it sounds like to me." The accusation was so absurd, so far from anything Marcus had said or implied, that he almost laughed. Instead, he felt a cold anger settling in his chest. They were twisting his words, making him out to be the aggressor in a situation where he was clearly the victim. "I am not threatening anyone," Marcus replied, his military training keeping his voice level. "I am simply stating facts about my service to this country and my right to occupy a seat I legally purchased." But it was too late. The flight attendant had already signaled to someone outside the aircraft. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers appeared at the entrance to the cabin. They were both large men, dressed in black uniforms with radios crackling on their shoulders. Their presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the cabin from uncomfortable tension to something approaching fear. "Gentlemen," the senior flight attendant said to the security officers, "we have a passenger who's being disruptive and refusing to comply with crew instructions. He needs to be removed from the aircraft." Marcus watched in disbelief as the security officers approached him. One was older, with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested he had seen too many of these incidents. The younger officer looked eager, his hand resting casually on his radio as if hoping for trouble. "Sir," the older officer said in a weary voice, "we're going to need you to come with us." "On what grounds?" Marcus asked. "I haven't violated any airline policies or federal regulations. I haven't been disruptive or threatening. I simply refuse to give up a seat I paid for." The younger security officer stepped forward. "Sir, the flight crew has the authority to remove any passenger they deem problematic. If you don't come voluntarily, we can make this more difficult for everyone involved." Marcus looked around the cabin one more time. Every passenger was watching now, some with their phones out recording everything. He realized that no matter how this ended, it would be documented and shared across social media within hours. The question was whether he would be portrayed as a victim of discrimination or as a troublemaker who got what he deserved. The elderly gentleman near the front suddenly spoke up. "Excuse me," he said in a crisp upper-class accent, "but I've been listening to this entire exchange and I haven't heard this gentleman do anything wrong. He's been polite, respectful, and reasonable throughout. This is absolutely disgraceful." A few other passengers murmured agreement, but the flight attendant was unmoved. "Sir, please don't involve yourself in this situation. We have procedures we must follow." Marcus made his decision. He reached into the overhead compartment and retrieved his carry-on bag, moving with deliberate slowness to show he was not a threat. As he did so, something fell from his jacket pocket onto the seat. His military identification card, the one that identified him as Captain Marcus Wellington of Her Majesty's Royal Guard. The businessman behind him, still recording, zoomed in on the ID card. "Holy hell," he muttered loud enough for others to hear. "This guy's a bloody Royal Guard." The news rippled through the cabin like wildfire. Passengers began whispering to each other, pointing at Marcus and then at his ID card. The captain, who had started to walk away, stopped and turned back, his face pale. But the senior flight attendant, either too proud to admit her mistake or too committed to her course of action, remained unmoved. "That doesn't change anything," she announced. "He's still being disruptive and refusing to follow crew instructions." Marcus picked up his ID card and put it back in his pocket. He looked directly at the flight attendant, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "You're right," he said. "My service to the Crown doesn't entitle me to special treatment. But it also doesn't disqualify me from basic human dignity and the rights of any paying customer." He turned to the security officers. "Gentlemen, I'll come with you voluntarily, but I want it on record that I am being removed from this flight not for anything I did, but for who you think I am." As Marcus walked down the aisle toward the aircraft exit, followed by the security officers, he could hear passengers talking behind him. Some were expressing outrage at his treatment. Others were discussing whether they should post their videos online, and a few were already calling the airline's customer service number. The businessman who had recorded everything suddenly called out, "Captain Wellington." Marcus turned back. "I'm posting this everywhere. The whole world is going to see how they treated you." Marcus nodded once, then continued walking. As he stepped off the aircraft and back into the terminal, he had no idea that his quiet dignity in the face of humiliation was about to spark a chain of events that would reach the highest levels of British society and change airline policies forever. The world takes notice. Marcus found himself sitting in the airport security office, still trying to process what had just happened. The older security officer, whose name tag read Jenkins, sat across from him with a cup of coffee and a sympathetic expression. The younger officer had disappeared after realizing there was no actual security threat to investigate. "Captain Wellington," Jenkins said quietly, "I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of things I'm not proud of. What happened on that aircraft today? That wasn't right." Marcus appreciated the man's honesty, but he was focused on a more immediate problem. "I need to get to New York," he said. "My daughter's graduation is tomorrow evening. Is there another flight I can catch?" Jenkins pulled up the flight schedules on his computer. "Next flight to JFK doesn't leave until tomorrow morning. You'd miss the ceremony." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "There's an evening flight to Newark, but it's completely booked." As they spoke, Jenkins's radio crackled to life. "Control to Jenkins, we've got media requesting access to the terminal." "Something about an incident with a Royal Guard?" Marcus closed his eyes. He had hoped to handle this quietly, perhaps file a complaint later through proper channels. But in the age of social media, nothing stayed quiet for long. "The videos are already online," Jenkins explained apologetically. "That businessman posted it on Twitter about 10 minutes ago. It's got thousands of shares already." Marcus's phone, which he had kept on silent, suddenly buzzed with notification after notification. Text messages, missed calls, social media alerts. His quiet humiliation was becoming a public spectacle. The first call was from his daughter Sarah in New York. "Dad, what the hell is happening? There's a video of you being dragged off a plane all over the internet. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," Marcus assured her. "Just a misunderstanding with the airline. I'm working on getting another flight." "Dad, this isn't a misunderstanding. I watched the video. They profiled you. This is discrimination, plain and simple." Sarah's voice was shaking with anger. "As a law student, I can tell you this is exactly the kind of case that needs to be fought." Before Marcus could respond, another call came through. This one was from Colonel Harrison, his commanding officer at the Royal Guard. "Marcus, I just got off the phone with Buckingham Palace. They want to know what happened, and they want to know now." The weight of the situation was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about missing his daughter's graduation anymore. This was becoming a national incident that could have serious implications for his career and the reputation of the Royal Guard. Meanwhile, back on the aircraft, the atmosphere had become toxic. The flight, which should have departed 30 minutes ago, was still sitting at the gate. Several first-class passengers were demanding to speak with the captain about what they had witnessed. The elderly gentleman who had spoken up for Marcus was on his phone with what sounded like a reporter. "Yes, that's right," he was saying loudly enough for everyone to hear. "They threw a decorated Royal Guard off this flight for no reason other than the color of his skin. It was absolutely disgraceful. His name, Captain Marcus Wellington. Look him up. 15 years of distinguished service to the Crown." The senior flight attendant who had initiated Marcus's removal was nowhere to be seen. Word was that she had been escorted off the aircraft by airline management and was being held in a meeting room somewhere in the terminal. The captain was still on board, but he looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. The businessman who had posted the original video was now doing a live stream from his seat, providing commentary on the incident to his growing online audience. You can see the captain there, still trying to pretend this is normal procedure. "But I've got news for them. I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what just happened to that man." Social media had exploded with reactions to the video. Just as For Marcus was trending on Twitter within an hour, the video had been shared by celebrities, politicians, and news organizations. People were posting their own stories of airline discrimination, creating a virtual avalanche of similar incidents that had previously gone unreported. The palace's initial response was carefully worded but unmistakably supportive of Marcus. A spokesperson issued a statement. "Captain Wellington is a distinguished member of Her Majesty's Royal Guard who has served with honor for 15 years. The royal family takes any allegations of discrimination against its personnel very seriously and expects a full investigation into this incident." The airline's corporate headquarters was in crisis mode. Emergency meetings were being called, lawyers were being consulted, and public relations specialists were crafting damage control strategies. The company's stock price had already begun to dip as investors worried about the potential backlash. British Airways issued their first statement within 2 hours of the incident. "We are aware of the incident involving Captain Wellington and are conducting a thorough investigation. We do not tolerate discrimination in any form and are committed to ensuring all passengers are treated with dignity and respect." But the statement felt hollow compared to the powerful imagery of the video, which showed a dignified man being humiliated simply for existing in a space where others felt he didn't belong. Back in the security office, Marcus was fielding calls from reporters, fellow service members, and friends who had seen the news. His phone battery was dying from the constant activity, but the calls kept coming. One call stood out from the rest. It was from Richard Montgomery, a civil rights lawyer who had built his reputation on high-profile discrimination cases. "Captain Wellington, I've seen the video and I've read about your service record. This case has the potential to create real change in how airlines treat passengers. I'd like to represent you pro bono." Marcus was hesitant. He had never been one to seek the spotlight, preferring to serve quietly and let his actions speak for themselves. But as he thought about his daughter's words and the hundreds of supportive messages flooding his phone, he realized this was bigger than his personal comfort. What would that involve? He asked. Full investigation, civil lawsuit, and most importantly, systematic changes to prevent this from happening to anyone else. The video evidence is crystal clear, and your service record makes you an unimpeachable plaintiff. This could be the case that finally forces airlines to confront their bias problems. As Marcus considered the lawyer's offer, Jenkins reappeared with news that would change everything. "Captain, I just got word from upstairs. There's been a development you need to know about." The look on Jenkins's face suggested that whatever he was about to say would either make Marcus's situation much better or much worse. In the complex calculus of modern public relations disasters, it was sometimes hard to tell the difference. "The palace intervenes." Jenkins leaned forward with an expression that Marcus had never seen on a security officer's face before, something between amazement and disbelief. "Captain Wellington, I've been instructed to escort you to the VIP lounge immediately. You have visitors." "Visitors?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew what this meant. When incidents involving the Royal Guard made international news within hours, there were protocols that kicked into motion automatically. As they walked through the terminal, Marcus noticed that their path had been cleared of regular passengers. Airport staff lined the corridors, some openly staring, others pretending to be busy with their duties. Word had spread quickly through the airport about what had happened, and about who Marcus really was. The VIP lounge was located in a quiet section of the terminal that Marcus had never seen before, despite his years of flying through Heathrow. Jenkins used a special key card to access the area, and they were met by a woman in an elegant navy suit who introduced herself simply as Margaret from the palace. Inside the lounge, Marcus was surprised to find not only Margaret, but also two other individuals whose presence immediately elevated the seriousness of the situation. One was Sir James Whitmore, the private secretary to Her Majesty, a man whose influence extended far beyond his formal title. The other was someone Marcus recognized from television, Emma Richardson, a junior minister from the Home Office who handled issues related to discrimination and civil rights. "Captain Wellington," Sir James said, rising from his chair with the kind of formal courtesy that characterized all palace interactions. "Please sit down. We need to discuss what happened today." Margaret gestured toward a comfortable leather chair while a member of the lounge staff quietly placed a cup of tea on the table beside him. The entire scene felt surreal. Hours ago, he had been treated as a second-class citizen, and now he was being served tea by palace representatives in the most exclusive part of the airport. "First," Sir James continued, "you should know that Her Majesty is personally aware of this incident. She has asked me to convey her complete support for you and her displeasure at your treatment by the airline." Marcus felt a surge of emotion that he quickly suppressed. In 15 years of service, he had never received direct acknowledgement from the Queen herself. The fact that she had taken a personal interest in his situation was both humbling and overwhelming. Minister Richardson leaned forward, her expression serious. "Captain Wellington, what happened to you today represents exactly the kind of institutional discrimination that this government has pledged to eliminate. We cannot allow British citizens, especially those who have served their country with such distinction, to be treated this way." Margaret opened a tablet and showed Marcus something that made his jaw drop. The original video of his removal had been viewed over 2 million times in just 4 hours. But more importantly, the responses weren't just from random social media users. Members of parliament from both parties were condemning the airline's actions. Celebrity supporters were using their platforms to share the story. International news organizations were picking up the story as an example of discrimination in British society. The airline has requested a meeting, Sir James explained. Their CEO, board members, and entire crisis management team are flying in from headquarters. They understand that this situation has implications far beyond a single passenger complaint. What do they want? Marcus asked. They want to make this go away, Minister Richardson replied bluntly. They'll offer you money, apologies, lifetime privileges, whatever they think will convince you to accept their narrative that this was a simple misunderstanding by a few rogue employees. Margaret pulled up another screen on her tablet. Captain, you should know that our investigation has already begun. We've spoken with other passengers on that flight, reviewed security footage from the terminal, and examined the airline's training materials and internal communications. She paused, her expression grim. What we found suggests this wasn't an isolated incident. There's a pattern of discriminatory behavior, particularly in first-class cabins, that the airline has been quietly managing through payoffs and non-disclosure agreements. Marcus felt his anger rising again. But this time it was tempered by something else, a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about his humiliation anymore. It was about countless other passengers who had faced similar treatment, but lacked his platform and resources to fight back. They've also been monitoring social media about your case, Sir James added. The public response has been overwhelmingly supportive of you, but the airline is preparing a counter-narrative. They plan to suggest that you were actually disruptive, that your military service doesn't excuse inappropriate behavior, that the crew was simply following safety protocols. That's not what happened, Marcus said firmly. We know, Minister Richardson replied. And we have the evidence to prove it. But they're hoping that by controlling the narrative and settling quietly, they can minimize the long-term damage to their brand. Margaret leaned forward. Captain Wellington, you have choices to make. You can accept their settlement, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and this becomes a private matter between you and the airline. Or you can allow us to support you in taking this public fight to its conclusion. What would that involve? Sir James answered. Full investigation by multiple government agencies, parliamentary hearings on discrimination in the transportation industry, potential criminal charges against the individuals involved, and most importantly, systemic changes to prevent this from happening to anyone else. Marcus thought about his daughter, probably sitting in her dorm room in New York, watching her father's humiliation become international news. He thought about the other passengers on that flight, some who had supported him and others who had remained silent. He thought about all the people who might face similar situations in the future. There's something else you should know, Margaret said quietly. We've been contacted by civil rights organizations, veteran advocacy groups, and anti-discrimination lawyers from around the world. This case has become symbolic of larger issues that extend far beyond one airline or one incident. Minister Richardson pulled out her phone and showed Marcus a message. This is from the American Civil Liberties Union. They want to file a friend of the court brief in any legal proceedings. Similar offers have come from organizations in Canada, Australia, and throughout Europe. The scope of what his situation had become was staggering. Marcus had always been a private person, someone who preferred to serve quietly without fanfare. Now he was being asked to become the face of a movement he had never asked to lead. I need to ask you directly, Sir James said, his tone becoming more formal. Are you prepared to see this through to the end, regardless of the personal cost? Because once we commit to this path, there's no turning back. The airline will use every resource at their disposal to discredit you, to minimize their liability, and to control the narrative. Marcus thought about his 15 years of service, about the oath he had taken to protect not just the royal family, but the principles they represented. He thought about justice, dignity, and the responsibility that came with his uniform, even when he wasn't wearing it. Minister Richardson, he said finally, what exactly would success look like in this case? Her answer would determine not just his next move, but the direction of a fight that was about to consume his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The battle lines are drawn. Minister Richardson set down her cup of tea and looked directly at Marcus with the intensity of someone who had spent years fighting institutional discrimination. Success, Captain Wellington. would mean that no passenger ever again has to endure what you experienced today. It would mean comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all airline staff, independent oversight of passenger treatment complaints, and financial penalties severe enough to make airlines think twice before allowing bias to influence their decisions. She paused, pulling up additional information on her tablet. But more than that, success would mean changing the culture that made your treatment possible in the first place. The assumption that someone who looks like you doesn't belong in first class, the willingness of staff to act on those assumptions, and the system that protected them from consequences, all of that needs to change. Sir James nodded in agreement. The Palace's interest in this case goes beyond supporting one of our own, though that is certainly important. This incident has international implications for how Britain is perceived on matters of equality and justice. We cannot allow the world to think that this behavior represents British values. As they spoke, Margaret's phone buzzed constantly with updates from various sources. She glanced at it periodically, her expression growing more serious with each message. The airline's response is accelerating, she reported. They've hired Cromwell & Associates, the crisis management firm that specializes in high-profile discrimination cases. They're preparing a comprehensive media strategy to reframe the narrative. What kind of strategy? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew. Character assassination, Minister Richardson said bluntly. They'll dig into every aspect of your life, looking for anything they can use to discredit you. Previous complaints, financial difficulties, personal relationships, anything that might make you seem less sympathetic to the public. Margaret pulled up a document on her tablet. We've already seen the beginning of this. Anonymous sources at the airline are claiming you were intoxicated, that you used threatening language, that other passengers complained about your behavior before the crew ever approached you. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. None of that is true. We know, Sir James replied. But truth and perception don't always align in these situations. They're banking on the fact that most people will remember the allegations, not the retractions that come later. However, Minister Richardson added with a slight smile, they've made a crucial miscalculation. They're treating this like a standard passenger complaint case, not understanding that your service record and the Palace's involvement have changed the entire dynamic. She showed Marcus her phone screen, which displayed a news alert. The story just broke in the Times. The headline reads, Royal Guard humiliated by airline discrimination, Palace demands answers. Within an hour, this will be the lead story on every major news program in the country. Margaret looked up from her own phone with an expression of amazement. The Prime Minister's office just called. They want to issue a statement supporting you and announcing a comprehensive review of discrimination practices in the transportation industry. Marcus realized that what had started as a personal humiliation was rapidly becoming a matter of national policy. The weight of that responsibility was both daunting and motivating. There's something else, Sir James said quietly. We've received preliminary information suggesting that this airline has been settling similar cases regularly for years. If that's true, your case could open the floodgates for dozens, possibly hundreds of other victims to come forward. As if summoned by his words, Margaret's tablet chimed with an urgent message. She read it quickly, her eyes widening. Speak of the devil. We've just been contacted by 7 other passengers who say they experienced similar treatment on flights with this same airline within the past 2 years. They want to join any legal action you might file. Marcus thought about those 7 people, probably sitting at home watching the news about his case and recognizing their own experiences in his story. How many others were there who had simply accepted their treatment, paid for lesser seats, or chosen different airlines without ever speaking up? Captain Wellington, Minister Richardson said, her voice taking on a more formal tone. I need to ask you a direct question. Are you prepared to become the public face of this fight? Because that's what will happen if we move forward. Your privacy, your quiet life, your ability to serve anonymously, all of that will be gone. Marcus thought about his daughter Sarah, probably fielding questions from her classmates and professors about her father's situation. He thought about his colleagues in the Royal Guard, men and women who had signed up to serve their country, but not necessarily to become symbols of social justice movements. Can I speak with my daughter first? He asked. Of course, Sir James replied, but I should tell you that time is working against us. The airline's crisis team will be implementing their strategy within hours. The longer we wait to respond, the more control they gain over the narrative. Margaret handed Marcus a secure phone. "This line is encrypted. You can speak freely," Sarah answered on the first ring. "Dad, please tell me you're going to fight this." Her immediate response surprised him. "Sarah, this could get very complicated. It might affect your graduation, your future career prospects, our family's privacy." "Dad, stop." His daughter's voice carried a firmness that reminded him of her mother. "I'm a law student at Columbia University. Do you think I care more about my graduation ceremony than about justice? What happened to you today happens to people every day, but most of them don't have your platform or your credentials to fight back." She paused, and Marcus could hear the emotion in her voice when she continued. "You've spent 15 years protecting the crown and everything it represents. Well, equality and justice are supposed to be part of what it represents. This is your chance to protect those values for everyone, not just the royal family." Marcus felt a surge of pride in his daughter's words. She had inherited not just his sense of duty, but also his moral clarity about right and wrong. "Besides," Sarah added with a slight laugh, "I've already called the dean and explained the situation. The university is holding my graduation ceremony until you can get here. Apparently, having a student's father become an international symbol of civil rights is the kind of publicity Columbia Law School doesn't mind waiting for." When Marcus hung up the phone, he found 3 pairs of eyes watching him expectantly. The decision that had seemed so difficult moments earlier now felt inevitable. "Minister Richardson," he said, "what do we need to do first?" Sir James smiled for the first time since Marcus had met him. "First, we coordinate our response with your legal representation. The lawyer who called you earlier, Richard Montgomery, has already filed preliminary paperwork to preserve evidence and prevent the airline from destroying any internal communications related to your case." Margaret pulled up another screen on her tablet. "We've also arranged for you to speak with investigative journalists from The Guardian, BBC, and ITV. They want to do comprehensive pieces on discrimination in the airline industry, using your case as the centerpiece." "And the airline?" Marcus asked. "What's their next move?" Minister Richardson's expression hardened. "They've requested a meeting for tomorrow morning. They want to present what they're calling a generous settlement offer that would resolve this matter quickly and quietly." "Let me guess," Marcus said. "Money, apologies, and a non-disclosure agreement that prevents me from talking about what happened." "Exactly. But they've miscalculated badly. This isn't just about you anymore. The government has a stake in this case. The palace has a stake in it. And the public has made it clear they won't accept a quiet settlement." Margaret showed Marcus her tablet screen, which displayed real-time social media metrics. The hashtag #JusticeForMarcus has been used over 100,000 times in the past 6 hours. The original video has been viewed 8 million times. This has become a global story about discrimination and accountability. Sir James leaned forward. "Captain Wellington, tomorrow's meeting with the airline will set the tone for everything that follows. They'll try to make you feel like you're being unreasonable for not accepting their offer. They'll suggest that dragging this out publicly will hurt everyone involved, including you. What they won't tell you," Minister Richardson added, "is that they've already calculated the cost of settling with you quietly versus the cost of systematic changes to their policies. They believe buying your silence is the cheaper option." Marcus thought about all the passengers who had sat silently during his humiliation, afraid to speak up or get involved. He thought about the airline staff who had witnessed obvious discrimination but said nothing. He thought about the culture that made such incidents possible, and the system that protected those responsible. "They're wrong about the cost," he said finally, "because this isn't just about money. It's about whether we live in a society where people are judged by their character and qualifications, or by assumptions based on their appearance." Margaret's phone buzzed with another urgent message. She read it quickly, then looked up with an expression of grim satisfaction. "The airline just made another mistake. They've issued a statement. Justice prevails." The conference room on the 35th floor of the airline's corporate headquarters buzzed with nervous energy. Marcus sat at one end of the polished mahogany table, flanked by Richard Montgomery, Minister Richardson, and a representative from the palace legal team. Across from them sat the airline's CEO, Chief Legal Counsel, Head of Public Relations, and several other executives whose titles suggested the company was taking this matter very seriously. The CEO, A thin man named David Hartwell, who looked like he hadn't slept in days, opened the meeting with what sounded like a rehearsed statement. Captain Wellington, we deeply regret the misunderstanding that occurred yesterday. Our company has always prided itself on treating all passengers with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. Marcus noticed that Hartwell couldn't quite meet his eyes as he spoke. Focusing instead on his notes or the other people at the table, the word misunderstanding hung in the air like an insult, minimizing what had clearly been deliberate discrimination. We're prepared to offer you a substantial settlement, Hartwell continued, sliding a folder across the table. Full refund of your ticket, £10,000 in compensation, lifetime upgrades to first class on any of our flights, and a personal apology from our staff training director. Richard Montgomery opened the folder without expression, glanced at the contents, then closed it again. And in exchange for this generous offer, Captain Wellington would agree to sign a non-disclosure agreement, preventing him from discussing this incident publicly. That's standard procedure in cases like this, the airline's legal counsel interjected. It protects both parties from ongoing litigation and allows everyone to move forward constructively. Minister Richardson leaned forward. Mr. Hartwell, are you familiar with the concept of institutional discrimination? The CEO looked uncomfortable. I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating directly that your airline has a documented pattern of discriminatory behavior that extends far beyond yesterday's incident with Captain Wellington. She opened her own folder and began reading. Mrs. Fatima al-Rashid, British citizen of Pakistani origin, removed from first class in March 2023 after complaints from other passengers about her suspicious behavior, which consisted of praying quietly before takeoff. Mr. James Okafor, decorated RAF veteran, denied boarding to business class in August 2023 because gate staff didn't believe his military discount was legitimate. Dr. Priya Sharma, NHS surgeon traveling to an emergency medical conference, moved from first class to economy because flight attendants decided she looked too young to afford the ticket. With each case she read, the executives looked more uncomfortable. Marcus realized this wasn't just about his individual experience. It was about a systematic problem that the airline had been quietly managing through payoffs and silence. All of these passengers, Minister Richardson continued, accepted settlements with non-disclosure agreements. They took your money and stayed quiet, allowing these problems to continue unchecked. Hartwell's composure was beginning to crack. Those are isolated incidents. Every large airline occasionally has staff who make mistakes in judgment. Isolated incidents? Richard Montgomery pulled out his own stack of documents. We've identified 23 similar cases in the past 3 years, all involving passengers of color or non-Christian faith, all settled quietly with NDAs. That's not isolation. That's a pattern. The airline's head of public relations, a woman who had been frantically checking her phone throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. The situation has evolved significantly since yesterday. The media attention, the social media response, the government involvement, this has become much bigger than a single passenger complaint. She was right, and everyone in the room knew it. Marcus's case had become a symbol of larger issues that couldn't be buried with money and legal agreements. The story had gone international, with news organizations from around the world using it to examine discrimination in their own countries. Let me be direct, Minister Richardson said. The government is prepared to initiate a comprehensive investigation of discrimination practices across the entire airline industry. Parliamentary hearings will be scheduled. Regulatory oversight will be strengthened. And if necessary, we will recommend legislation requiring independent monitoring of passenger treatment complaints. The threat was clear, and its implications were staggering. The entire airline industry would face scrutiny because of this case, creating pressure for change that went far beyond any individual settlement. Hartwell looked around the table at his advisors, all of whom seemed to be silently urging him to find a way out of this situation. What exactly are you proposing? Richard Montgomery answered. Full acknowledgement of discrimination, public apology to Captain Wellington and all other affected passengers, immediate termination of the staff members involved in yesterday's incident, comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all employees, independent oversight of future complaints, and establishment of a victim compensation fund for all passengers who, experienced similar treatment. The financial implications of what you're describing could be enormous. The legal counsel protested. The financial implications of continuing your current practices are even greater, Minister Richardson replied, because this case has demonstrated that discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's also terrible business. Your stock price has dropped 12% since yesterday. Major corporate clients are reconsidering their travel contracts with your airline. The reputational damage is exponential. Marcus had remained silent through most of the meeting, but now he felt compelled to speak. Mr. Hartwell, I didn't ask to become the face of this issue. I just wanted to fly to my daughter's graduation. But what happened to me yesterday was the result of assumptions your staff made about who belongs in first class and who doesn't. He leaned forward, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of command. I've spent 15 years protecting this country and its values. One of those values is supposed to be that all citizens are treated equally, regardless of their race or religion or economic background. Your airline failed that basic test of British decency. Hartwell finally met Marcus's eyes. Captain Wellington, what would it take for you to consider this matter resolved? Marcus looked at Richard Montgomery, who nodded encouragingly. It's not about what I would consider resolved. It's about ensuring that no other passenger has to experience what I went through. It's about changing the culture that made yesterday's incident possible. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with lawyers drafting preliminary agreements and executives making phone calls to corporate headquarters. In the end, the airline agreed to terms that were unprecedented in discrimination cases. They would publicly acknowledge that Marcus had been the victim of racial discrimination. They would implement comprehensive reforms, including mandatory bias training, independent oversight of passenger complaints, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Most importantly, they would establish a £10 million fund to compensate other victims and support anti-discrimination initiatives. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same first-class cabin where his ordeal had begun, but this time he was there as a guest speaker for the airline's new diversity training program. The flight attendants, all new staff, as the original crew had been terminated, listened attentively as he described the impact of discrimination from a victim's perspective. The airline's transformation had been remarkable. Independent audits showed a dramatic improvement in passenger treatment complaints. Other airlines had voluntarily adopted similar policies to avoid facing their own discrimination scandals. Parliament had passed new legislation strengthening oversight of the transportation industry. Most importantly, the culture had begun to change. Social media monitoring showed that incidents of airline discrimination had decreased significantly across the industry. Passengers felt more empowered to report bias when they experienced it, knowing their complaints would be taken seriously. Marcus's daughter Sarah had graduated with honors from Columbia Law School and was now working for a civil rights organization. Inspired by her father's case to dedicate her career to fighting discrimination, she often told people that watching her father's dignity in the face of humiliation had taught her more about justice than any law school course ever could. The businessman who had recorded the original incident became an advocate for passenger rights, using his platform to highlight discrimination cases and support victims. He often said that witnessing Marcus's treatment had opened his eyes to injustices he had previously ignored. On the first anniversary of the incident, Marcus received a letter from Buckingham Palace. Her Majesty had decided to award him the Officer of the Order of the British Empire, not for his military service, but for his role in advancing civil rights and equality. The citation read, "For services to justice and for demonstrating that true courage sometimes means standing up to discrimination rather than standing down from it." Marcus kept the letter in the same pocket where he had carried his military identification on that fateful day. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefire,